Good afternoon, friends, and welcome to what I hope will be a fascinating conversation. We're having a very analog discussion here about big data, so no presentations, no facts, but some very well-informed opinions. As you may know, Hal Varian of Google said that statistics is now sexy, which is probably why you're in this room. 10, 20 years ago, an event on data might not have had quite so many people interested in finding out what it's about. And I'm going to kick us off by really asking, so where are we in terms of the significance of this whole field of big data in cities? On the one side, there's a huge amount of excitement, enthusiasm, and activity. Well over 1 million public data sets are now open for people to mash and mine and use in different ways. I think there's 60 or maybe 70 nations in the Open Government Partnership. Very grand claims being made about the amount of money which can be mined out of public data. Some of it was on that screen before. And all over the world, lots of projects, some run by startups, NGOs, cities themselves, using data in creative ways around everything from transport to examples I like include Vienna, where you can find the nearest edible fruit tree, or Finland, which has this amazing app to help blind people navigate around the city, many, many others. But I want to ask our speakers whether they think we are on in a wave of extraordinary opportunity, or whether they share any of the views of the skeptics who say this is still mainly hype and hot air. Most of the big data applications in cities are still fairly trivial, not really solving fundamental problems of crime or education, housing, and so on, and that we may need to think about data in different ways to really get the full value out of it. So starting with you, Emer, what's your view? How important is this all?
Well, I would have to start off by saying that I'm definitely not a skeptic, because I just left my good job in government, which I've been in for the last 13 years, to work with a transport startup which works with open data. So I'm definitely hoping it's not just all a big con, or my mother will kill me. So, I mean, my background in open data goes back to 2009 when I worked for the Mayor of London City Hall as Director of Digital Projects there, and we set up the London Datastore. And I would say at that time there was a huge amount. I mean, everything was unproven at that point. We really weren't sure, what open data might do in terms of actual ROI. And that was one of the big barriers at the time, was everybody kept saying, what's the ROI? And one of the difficulties is that open data is very much about an emergent business model. So you can't predict in advance what the ROI is going to be. So that makes it kind of difficult catch-22 for governments, because they don't want to spend money on releasing data if they can't be guaranteed of actually making money from it. So a lot of the arguments really in the early days were about, you have to trust that if you open this up, innovation and technologists and entrepreneurs are going to be able to find ways of doing these, because let's not forget, the smartest minds are never in the room. And so in government, I don't think public officials are best placed to decide what's the next app that they're going to produce or what's the next business product or service. So I think the best thing the governments can do is to put that data out there and let those emergent business models happen when you have the collaboration of technologists and entrepreneurs coming into that. And we've certainly seen for certain sectors of data, transport is a huge one, for example, and I think that's the same globally, that once you open up real-time dynamic transport, you get fantastic products and services that really benefit citizens. So I don't think we could imagine the Cycle Hire scheme in London without the app that tells you where's the nearest docking station, whether or not that docking station is full, and all of those things that make the transport of citizens through global cities a lot less frictionless. And so I think that's quite important. The other thing I would say is that we're not really going to be able to answer the question as to whether it's hype or not until more data is released. And I think that points to one of the difficulties that cities have in terms of collaboration. So if you think it's difficult getting government to collaborate with itself internally, and I had an example of that in Transport for London, where one part of the organisation had to send a freedom of information request to another part of the organisation to get a particular data set. There are difficulties with the silos within government. Equally, the private sector and the commercial partners and systems integrators, for example, need also to collaborate not only with their own sector, but with government. And you add into that the need to have the citizen voice heard. And I think that's one of the things that's quite difficult. So the whole Smart City Sensing City agenda is not going to be delivered until you have a collaboration with all of those sectors. And we're certainly nowhere near that yet. So I would argue you're never going to find out what the ROI is unless you create those values and systems.
And just before moving on, give us what's the current live example which you find most exciting?
Well, currently in my own company, can I talk about that? So, for example, we're aggregating public data feeds for transport, and one of the technologies we're developing at the moment is a transport sentiment analysis, which is taking geolocated tweets for any reference anywhere in the UK to bus or a train company. And so we're getting some very interesting information about what drives commuters crazy. So you'll not be surprised to find that people in London absolutely go mad if you bring food onto the bus, right? But there's lots of interesting pictures about behaviours of drivers, for example, reports of antisocial behaviour, complaints. So very often if people are annoyed about train lateness, they won't necessarily tweet a message to the train company, but they will make that complaint. And so we're finding that with a lot of interest now from local media companies whose journalists want to be able to identify very quickly if something is happening in public transport. They can immediately tweet a person and say what's kicking off there. From a customer service point of view, an information point of view, that's obviously very exciting. And so you can put in a postcode for anywhere in the UK and get a very specific picture about what's happening in transport. So for me, that's kind of exciting.
Annoyed but visible. Yeah. Chris.
I'm here representing the New York City Mayor's Office of Data Analytics, and so our view is somewhat, I'm still in government, and it's very much inside government. So I agree with Emer, but I'll also offer our perspective as how we can work internally within the government to use our data resources to improve day-to-day operations. So as it's no surprise to anyone, New York City is a data-driven government led by a data-driven mayor. And Mayor Mike Bloomberg committed to the mayor's management report, which shares statistics on performance with citizens biannually. How are we doing? How are departments performing? And those statistics go from the very macro, how are we doing on fighting poverty, to the very specific, how are we doing on pruning our trees? Now, you might think, why do we care so much about pruning our trees, and how much do we know about our trees in New York City? Well, the Department of Parks and Recreations has jurisdiction over 2 million trees, I think, in New York City. And not only do they have 2 million trees, but they measure the pruning of those trees. And what does that mean? They know where the tree is. They know how old the tree is. They know what kind of tree it was. They know when it was last pruned. Doesn't this kind of seem like we're beating ourselves to death with data on trees and their pruning schedule? But the answer is no. In fact, we actually see useful information out of this tree pruning data, which is if we show up, for instance, and we see that a tree is not there, we know that some sort of improper or illegal construction may have happened on the site. So I want to use that as a specific example to say we never would have had that data in the first place had it not been important for us to have business intelligence tools that reported on our day-to-day performance. Once you have a commitment to business performance reporting, and you're recording all these numbers, you might as well do something with that data, right? That data itself is kind of a raw good. And so what we do is we use all of the data that the city's operational departments are collecting every day. That could be the Parks Department. It could be the Sanitation Department picking up thousands of tons of recycling. It could be, every day we get 25,000 calls to 911. We get over 35,000 calls to 311. So we get information both from the city's 300,000 employees who are working in the field and 50, 60,000 data points from citizens calling in every day. And we see, merely collecting this information and reporting it would be missing a huge opportunity to actually use that data to better drive predictive analytics and to better allocate city resources. So I think in terms of where is big data and is it real, we see kind of an evolutionary step, which is we're going from business reporting to predictive analytics and resource allocation. Now, is that changing fundamentally the way that New Yorkers experience their government, or is it ending poverty instantly? No. I mean, it's a very small step on that route. And the very important next step is open data and making sure that all of the data that we're using, other than data that should be private, like tax records or personal health records, but any data that is relevant to city operations that we're collecting belongs to the citizens of New York and the people of the world, for that matter. I mean, if we're going to make it free to the citizens of New York. And pushing that data out will help us to create better solutions that not only are driven from what we think would make for better resource allocation in terms of building inspections, for instance, but also taking feedback both from the data community, but also from citizens in specific neighborhoods who can see what's going on and how the city can better tweak our analytics to serve them. So I'd say, very much in agreement on the value of open data. The London Datastore is a great example, and I hope that New York City's open data can become very prominent, well used as well. I think the short answer is yes, there's a lot of opportunity. I hope the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics is taking the evolutionary steps to get there, and what we see as next is open data, but also using that open data to enable partnerships between cities. One big challenge I'll mention, and should come as no surprise to anyone, take for instance restaurant grades. Many cities are doing them. San Francisco gives restaurant grades. New York City gives restaurant grades. San Francisco gives you a scale of 0 to 100. New York City gives you an ABCD letter grade. Who wants to bend, right, on terms of which standard is going to go forward, San Francisco or New York? So there are some challenges in getting this cooperation figured out. But overall, I think that we see a lot of interest from other cities in cooperating together. And I agree that open data is kind of the path to doing that.
Well, just one other question. I think the session after this one is called When Mayors Rule the World. This one perhaps could be called When Offices of Analytics Rule the City. Is there a plausible vision that in 5 years' time, every part of every city administration will be using predictive models to forecast perhaps crime by precinct, education results by individual, public health outcomes, and what then happens to the daily life of an official, or indeed the politics of the city, making these kind of open, transparent forecasts about your kids' educational performance?
I'll maybe answer your question with a lot of questions rather than answering it, but it presents a lot of interesting questions. For instance, if we have a predictive analytics model that tells us that certain buildings are more likely to have a catastrophic fire, and we then don't send inspectors out to those buildings, even though we believe based on our model they're the most likely buildings to have a dangerous fire, are we now negligent in serving the citizens who live in those buildings?
And what happens to their insurance bills? Yeah.
Does their insurance bill go up? And I think a lot of it is dependent on, we're taking baby steps, so I don't want to speak too far in the future, but a lot of it also depends on public attitudes towards privacy of data.
Okay. Anthony's just written a book called On Smart Cities. So what's your view of the importance of this whole field?
Yeah, so one of the things you get when writing a book is you get an opportunity to talk to people who are doing amazing things on the ground, like the people I'm sharing this panel with. But you also get to take a big picture perspective on stuff. And one of the points I really want to make is that big urban data is not a new thing. And in fact, if you trace back the history of one of the corporations that's most aggressively evangelizing the idea of business analytics as a tool for cities, which is IBM, that company has its origins in the machines that were developed to tabulate the 1890 census in the United States. Herman Holler's Tabulating Machine Company. I mean, why don't we name companies like that anymore? It would have to be like tabulator without an E at the end. But this is the biggest data collection effort in the history of the world, and it was done because a Congress made up of mostly rural landowners was totally freaked out by the industrial growth of cities and all the immigrants that were showing up and the social problems that was causing. So, and there have been waves of interest, especially after World War II, all of the new computing technology that had been developed for Cold War planning and air defense applied to urban simulation. And this is like the third great wave, I think, of urban informatics. So let's keep that in mind. Second point, a lot of what we do when we talk about big urban data, a lot of what's interesting for planners and policymakers isn't really big data by scientific standards. And I love to actually think about what is big data. Some people say it's anything that's too big to fit in an Excel spreadsheet, which is like more than 1 million records. If you talk to the really hardcore geeks, they'll say it's anything that's so big you can't use a conventional relational database. You have to use something called Hadoop, which is a piece of software that Yahoo developed as the web scaled. And I think what's interesting for us is the in-between. It's whatever's between like 1 million records and 5 trillion records. And I think calling it big data intimidates a lot of people who should be playing with it and working with it, people in NGOs, community activists, citizens, and it sort of professionalizes the analysis of this stuff, which there's so many tools now that lay people can get their hands dirty with it. So, and the other piece of that that's important is that there's this kind of boom going on right now around the world in academic research units that are getting themselves into what they call urban science, which is basically deeply quantitative analysis of urban problems, precisely because the data is here now, and it's sucking in talent from from physics, from computer science, from statistics, that I think the real fruit of big urban data, the real breakthroughs in understanding how cities work is yet to come. And it may take up to a decade for that to happen. Third thing I want to say, I think there's a little bit too much emphasis in these discussions around big data in cities on just mining the data exhaust, whether it's the operational data of government that we just spoke about, or credit card transactions or cell phone records, to understand what's happening in cities. At the end of the book, I kind of got to this half-baked idea that I called slow data. And what I meant by that was I was looking at all of the new open source technologies that artists and hackers are using to design basically computers that interact with the physical world. One technology in particular called Arduino, it basically allows you to write like a program that'll figure out when your plant needs to be watered and then tweet all the people in your office and tell them to come water the plant. Really fun stuff. But it's from an urban designer's point of view, I want to figure out what I need and provision the city, instrument the city with sensors and networks that will deliver the data I need to solve the problem that has been identified by stakeholders. And then my number one concern, I think, about all this is that I think institutionally, governments and planning agencies and planners and public processes around planning are totally unprepared to take advantage of this. And actually, I think there's great risk that what we're actually going to end up doing is just arming lots of stakeholders in urban policy discussions and potentially arming the wrong people who have their own self-interest at mind and not the broader public interest. So that's what I'm working on now at NYU. We're trying to understand how big data is going to affect transportation planning in the future and what we have to do to get the next generation of planners prepared for it.
And just tell us, who are the wrong people?
I mean, I don't want to say developers, but they're the first ones that come to mind. Basically because their self-interest is really, really clear and they have the resources to leverage big data to be effective. And we've seen places around the world where we've had the World Bank digitizing land records and stuff, that it isn't the poor people that get helped. It's developers who want to quickly assemble parcels for development.
I want to ask you each what might be the really fundamental problems which big data or data, whatever we want to call it, is helpful for. One of the most famous examples of sort of urban policy was, in some ways, a data analytics exercise done cross-correlating cholera deaths with where people got their water. And that was in the 1850s, showed the particular pump, was basically killing people and then led to a whole series of reforms around clean water and sewage. That was a use of data which saved huge numbers of lives. Where do you see the equivalence in the next 5 or 10 years of where the tools, which are now phenomenal, the array of data sets, amazing, but where we'll be able to tell stories of really fundamental solutions to really compelling problems? Who wants to start on that? Emer.
Well, I suppose, health in the last number of years, I think, has become largely an adopter of data, but I think the whole sort of self-monitoring, of your own health conditions, which can be then sent to, to your own GP, so allowing people to take a lot more responsibility for their own health. And I think for, independent, a lot of work being done around Alzheimer's, now collecting data, assisted environments for people living with dementia. I think these are all fantastic things which will allow people to live, more for longer, more independent lives on their own. So I think that whole kind of monitoring, self-monitoring area is going to be something that's going to be really important. That would be my call.
Not to sound too, in the tank or in the weeds in what we do, but there's a huge opportunity just to understand the day-to-day efficient allocation of resources within a city, right? And so especially as you think about transportation and routing and paths and how we're sending out thousands of trucks every day and how we're delivering services, and even when you think about services like Amazon's same-day delivery or getting your groceries, the idea that data can be used to more effectively transport goods and cut down on environmental impact, I see as a huge opportunity.
So data is clearly very good at handling physical movements, logistics, and spotting waste. Do you see, though, a sort of more human uses of the kind Emer mentioned being important, which are about well-being or health outcomes rather than just the movement of things?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I don't want to say there's not an application in healthcare. I think there's a huge application in healthcare. There's a huge application in education. in transportation, in building design. I mean, I think that there are lots of ways. Everything the city is doing day to day, we can better monitor and improve by better understanding essentially where our resources are going.
And Anthony, where do you see the big, compelling success stories of the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of stuff that we're grappling with now, like how do we make the systems we have operate more efficiently, more effectively, better accountability, better transparency. That's sort of like the stuff we have to do, and it's great that we're doing it, and if it can pay for itself, even better. But what really gets me excited is the stuff like apps like Foursquare that are kind of fundamental. They're mining big data to kind of fundamentally transform the way we live and the way we experience cities. So, Foursquare has gone in its 3-year history from a company where it was a social network where you check in, it was a Facebook for places, you tell your friends where you are, to now they're mining that corpus of check-ins to basically point you towards stuff that will be serendipitous and fun. And that is a really interesting take on sort of the Jane Jacobs view of what cities are good for, and digitally enhancing places by basically looking at our taste graph, if you will.
Okay, I want to turn to questions of trust. We're obviously having this conversation slightly overshadowed by PRISM and so on. And let me give you a live example from an Asian city which is working on collecting data of every taxi journey in the city, where it started and where it ended. You aggregate those together and you can provide an app which allows anyone to know where on the street they should stand to have the best chance of getting a taxi. Lets every taxi driver know if they should turn right or left at a junction to get the best chance of having a fare. Now that's great, except of course if you have the precise records of which house you picked someone up at 2 a.m. and where you took them and so on, you get into quite sort of delicate territory. So you have to actually degrade the data in order to use it. So what do you see as the dynamics happening between, as it were, the possibility of the technology and the fears it elicits and the need to not just anonymize, but possibly also degrade data to make it trustworthy? Perhaps start with you, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously something we deal with all the time as a government entity that is using citizen data to better improve services, right? So it's interesting for me to think about the ways in which data norms have grown up over time, right? So if there's anyone in the room who owns property, I assume there are many people in the room who own property, it's probably no surprise to you that everyone knows how much you paid for the property. And you're probably not that upset about it. But for those of you that are renters, the idea that everyone would know what you signed for your lease seems insane. Why should people know what I'm paying for my rent? And yet those two pieces of information, what did the house cost and how much do we rent the house for, are essentially the same information, right? If you use some interest rates, any sort of basic model, you can estimate what someone is paying in rent. But that just goes to the difference of norms, right? So we very much expect that our property values will be public record. We do not expect our leases to be. Part of it is developing social norms along with the data. There are some things which should be legally protected, like education data, healthcare data, financial data, that are protected now. There are other things which are kind of in the gray area. For instance, how much water did you consume at your home? Should that information be available publicly? Could we show you just based on the building? What if there's only one person who lives at that building and now we know how much water they're using? So we see it as an opportunity to develop norms and help to make people more comfortable with data. But I guess what's interesting, I'd like to hear what the rest of the panel hears about this, and frustrating for us certainly, is that most people have a much higher level of trust for Foursquare or the taxi app than they do for the city they live in. So we try to be kind of behind the ball and pushing the data privacy.
And do you think that at the moment people trust both commercial use of data and public data more than they would if they actually knew what happened to it? Or is it rational trust or just ignorant trust?
With both public and private use? I think people would be, I mean, this is just an opinion, I think people would be very surprised to know that private corporations are selling demographic information to marketing companies all over the United States based on your behavior, and that companies can track that you're coming into their store, how often you come, not just how often people come, but how often you come to their store. Yeah, I think that would start to upset people. For some reason, not nearly as much as the government knowing how often you take public transport, except for that the government can put you in jail. And so I understand that's a big difference, yeah.
So Anthony, what do you think is going to happen to trust in data?
Well, this is something that I think the whole NSA thing has really woken people up to the risks of centralizing our internet infrastructure in the hands of a handful of American companies. And a lot of people in the tech world have been speculating that this is basically the end of the cloud for American business. I think that's a little overhyped, but if you look at some of the other players that are starting to move into this whole city space, like Intel, for example, which I must disclose is one of my clients, but they come at this from a very different perspective that you have to encrypt and secure your data the minute it's generated, and that means pushing out a lot of computing capability to the edges of the network, in our pockets, in the walls around us, in the buildings. And I think that that's a really positive direction for the infrastructure to go. And if you look at what sort of the privacy activists and the community activists are talking about, they want to put applications at the edge. So there's a really interesting project going on in Brooklyn right now called Tide Pools. That's basically allowing a poor community to create a map of its own assets and store that data on a local server and then share that through a machine interface with Google Maps or whoever wants to plug into it. And I think that may be the wave of the future, that we see communities sort of trying to figure out how to put firewalls so that their data doesn't get exported all the time.
And I think Microsoft and others are working on developing headers for data to make it impossible to reuse it for uses other than the originally authorized use, all of which will somewhat impede some of the things being talked about in terms of the future world of big data. I mean, Emer, do you see that happening, new either regulatorily imposed constraints on unauthorized reuse or individuals choosing?
Yeah, I mean, I've always taken the view that if you try and stop technologists doing something, you just give them the incentive to do it more. And they're invariably really clever, and they will find workarounds. So I think it's a difficult area, regulation. I do think there's an important point and a value, though, in communities, that point about communities, because it's been discussed somewhat today, the whole issue of the digital economy and who is benefiting from this data, who is gaining huge amount of financial gain at a very small triangle at the top. And so if you look at a company like Kodak, which at its heyday had 149,000 employees, 3 months after that company went bust, Instagram was bought over by Facebook for $1 billion. It had 13 employees. So if you look at that scale of a hollowing out in terms of who is that value accruing to, and remember that a lot of Instagram, Instagram is user-generated content, right? The creativity and the fun and all of the value that's in there was generated by all of us. And I can remember saying to my son a couple of years ago, who works for Facebook? And he said, well, people who work for Mark Zuckerberg. I said, no, you work for Mark Zuckerberg, right? Because all of his content is what is making that valuable. So I think there are going to be questions not only about privacy, but about the use of that. And Jaron Lanier, in his book, Who Owns the Future, talks a lot about the need to develop micro-licensing for our own content. So I think people are going to start getting pretty pissed off in the future when they realize the same scale of jobs are not going to be replicated, right? We are going to a very different world in the knowledge economy and information economy. And so all of the work that we do every day in every keystroke accrues to Mark Zuckerberg or to Google or to Instagram and these big companies. So I think we have issues about how are we going to generate the new jobs of the future. And I think if the communities have access to assets and databases which they can generate some income from, I think that's a really good thing. So I think it's about the digital economy, but also about privacy.
Okay, there's also on skills and jobs, there's clearly a massive sort of skills gap in the private sector everywhere, estimates of maybe 1 million sort of data jobs unfilled. We've done research in the UK showing big productivity gains for firms which have strong analytic capabilities relative to those which don't. Presumably the same is true of the public sector, that there's a risk of a big skills gap. How many employees will there be in New York City in 10 years' time with data in their title?
Great question. So today I'll tell you there are 8, right? And that's 8 out of 300,000. So that's not that many. And as you think, many city governments don't have 300,000 employees. So it's hard to imagine, making room for even one data employee. I think that the function, though, of what...
Give us a number, predictive modeling of how many people will in 10 years' time.
Well, I think it's going to take over a lot of current functions, right? So we're just talking about information, right? And policy analysts. And our office is called the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics. What is data analytics? As we were saying, big data itself is kind of a nebulous concept. Really, when you boil it down, we're talking about math. Who likes to use math? Everyone. Some people are better at it than others. But if you're a policy analyst today, there's a good chance that 10 years from now, you're going to be using very basic analytical tools that might sit on top of an open data platform or sit on top of an internal database that help you to understand what's going on in your workspace. So the number, I mean, 20%. No, I have no idea, but it will grow.
60,000 jobs, wow. Okay, Anthony.
I mean, I'm just stunned by the scope of the challenge. I've been working a lot with a company based in Atlanta called AirSage, which basically takes the same location trail data from cell phone providers that everyone was freaked out that the NSA was just looking at, not even actually using. And they get it every day from a couple major wireless providers, and it's anonymized when they get it. They package it up. They originally thought they were going to sell it to retail site selection people. It turns out that the #1 market for it right now is transportation planners. And so transportation planners are going from like a once every 5-year paper survey sample of 1% of the population of commuters to a real-time, comprehensive, massive scope of data that I don't know how they're going to get their heads around it, because when I see them look at it, it's just their jaw drops. You know, they're looking at this animation of all the ants moving around the city. And I just feel like the staffing up that's going to be required, the skilling up that's going to be required in government to absorb and make good use of and not misinterpret this pile of data that's coming at them it's a monumental challenge.
The city of Seoul in Korea is a good example of using mobile phone movement data now to plan bus routes and trains and so on, which is very different from even 2 years ago. I'm going to open up for comments or questions in a moment, but just before I do, I wanted to ask your views of, in a sense, smartness about smart cities, or data about data, or the evidence about evidence. Because one of the problems of the whole sort of smart cities field is it's full of claim and people selling often hardware and kit, but incredibly little evidence about what actually works, what actually delivers results. And if you're a mayor, it's really hard to know what you should buy or what you shouldn't. And they all complain that it's weird how unsmart these fields are about themselves. Is that a fair comment? And if so, where will the evidence come from? Do you want to start on that, Anthony?
Well, someone who spoke here earlier today is Sasha Hasselmeyer, who's running an outfit called CityMart, which is basically trying to certify technology vendors using evidence from previous deployments in other cities, and basically allowing cities to tell other cities what technologies are working and why.
Mm-hmm. In terms of very basic principles you can use experimental design, in the scientific method in terms of designing your analytics projects, so that you have a test and control group and you can kind of validate the results of your approach. If you're doing an analytics-based project, you shouldn't just kind of, throw caution to the wind, put some numbers in, and then check results and see that they're coming up more or less than you expected. You should have an actual method and experimental design in place to measure the results so you know what's working and what's not working. I think that's often easy to overlook, and it's actually very difficult sell in government that some people are going to get one policy prescription and others will get a different policy prescription. But ultimately, I think it's the best way to measure the effectiveness of a program over time.
Emer?
I sometimes think it's difficult for politicians to because when companies come in and say we want to build a smart platform for a smart city, as if it's a really easy linear thing, we're just going to plug it in, and they really do that because they want to own the kit, okay? And that's a big problem, having one company owning the kit for your city. For many reasons. And I think cities in reality are much more messy, and the legacy systems are much more difficult, and systems like the London Underground have been there for such a long time. It's not easy, so I think you're going to have a kind of a mesh, kind of collective, collaborative approach, as I mentioned earlier. And I think mayors and politicians are more attuned to that, actually. So I think sometimes these big companies that come in and say, we have an answer in a box, and now we're going to make your city smart, I think they're kind of viewed a bit suspiciously, actually.
Okay, let's open up. We have an audience full of experts and thoughtful people. So comments or questions. I'd like us at some point to get on to the issue of which kinds of data empower the wrong people, which Anthony mentioned earlier. It always used to worry me when the British government published burglary statistics broken down by and police clear-up rates, that the only people this was really useful for were burglars. But anyway, who's over here? Yeah. And if you could introduce yourself,
Sure.
please.
Hi, Luther Loaf, Director of Public Policy for Yelp. My question is for Chris. Chris, you'd mentioned that there's difficulty in standardization between cities on restaurant hygiene scores, but as hopefully many in this room know, we worked with folks and technologists inside city halls, including New York City, to develop an open data standard called Lives, which allows such a thing, folks that have ABC scores as well, 0 to 100. And we'd love to bring New York online, so the millions and millions of users who rely on Yelp to make their dining decisions are able to see those hygiene scores. Do you think it's realistic that we could get New York online before the end of this administration? Thank you.
I think there's a huge opportunity for data standards and cooperation across cities, right? Whether or not New York City participates in any specific standard, I won't comment on today. Although, I use Yelp. I think Yelp is a great product. How are we going to get to those data standards? In some ways, it's a balancing act, right, between leadership and also kind of we build it and then it happens, right? So if we put all of our open data out, and there are hundreds of cities sharing open data, and there are 2 outliers, it makes sense that the 2 outliers would change their data collection so that it matches the other cities, right? How will we know that we're at that point? It won't really start happening until someone wants to start using data across cities. Yelp wants to do that, and they're pushing for this, and I understand that. But until we see more pressure of cross-city collaboration, either city to city or businesses that need universal information across cities, we're going to be slow to adopt that.
And I'd like us to come maybe later to another sort of restaurant question, is how many of the most useful applications will combine, as it were, the top-down inspection data and citizen-generated data, and it's merging them together makes them more valuable. Peter.
Yes, thanks. My name is Peter Head. I've spent the last 2 years running a charity to create an open source platform for systems economic direction for cities, and so I've been investigating this whole area a lot, and there's 2 things I'd learned that I'd like to ask you about. And actually one of them is exactly the point that you've just asked about, which is the role of crowdsourcing of data. The city of Berlin has actually created a 3-dimensional model and has got a form that if you put a cursor over your own house, a form comes up and you can put your data of your house into it, the energy consumption, the water consumption. And this has been an experiment, and actually 20 or 30% of people in the city have entered their data. So they've now got a very accurate model of what's happening in the city. So that seems to show that crowdsourcing is a very good point.
Could you say what was their motive for doing it?
They wanted to create an energy model to actually go to 100% renewables. So they had to...
The individual citizens, were they just being good citizens?
Yeah, I guess so. They were just engaged and excited about contributing to the direction of 100% renewables, I suppose. But so the one question is the role of crowdsourcing. But the second point I've learned is that actually people are physiologically and in terms of our basic processes are similar all over the world. So actually, a lot of what we do in cities is actually similar. We all know what I mean. Also, trees are also very similar wherever they are in cities around the world. So there are actually global process databases which can be used by every city in the world to understand better what cities are doing. And there are people with those models and that information. And when you combine that with the idea of getting mobility data, as you've just described, and the final bit, are you using Earth observation data? Because now Landsat and European Space Agency provide very high resolution data on everything that's happening in a city, and the trees reminded me of that. And you can get that directly from the satellite, and it's refreshed every 10 days. And I'm not aware that any cities are using this, and it's free, this information. So there's a different way of coming at the data, which is actually going for the data you need rather than just taking the data that's available.
Who would like to comment on that? First, maybe the crowdsourcing point. What are really good examples of citizen-generated data?
I'm going to try and keep this brief, but you really made me think about a character that I encountered researching the novel, a guy named Patrick Geddes, who was a Scottish evolutionary biologist, late 19th century, helped really found the field of urban planning. And he presaged Jane Jacobs by like 60 years. He believed that every single person had to be involved in solving the problems of the city. And he basically built a building in Edinburgh called the Outlook Tower, which was like an urban dashboard that allowed people to come in and see his massive survey of the entire region, its landscape, its people, its industry, teach them about it, and then kick them out the front door and tell them to go do something about it. And I think we're entering a period where these two big forces of crowdsourcing and big data are allowing us to sort of like live up to that vision. You know, we can see the big picture in excruciating detail, you know, with all this data, but we can also craft opportunities for every person to push it their little inch along and do so collectively.
Let me respond specifically to the crowdsourcing and both the opportunity but also some of the questions we have to have about crowdsourcing information. I used to work for an energy efficiency company, and we had a similar product. People could input information about their energy use, look for energy efficiency tips, and we had a much lower percentage participation than 30%. But who were those percentage points people who were participating in our energy efficiency project? Well, they were mostly all people who had voted for Al Gore, right? And so there was a huge self-selection bias. And if you look at Foursquare data for New York City, and you looked at day-to-day operation of where Foursquare is operating, you would assume that people only live in Midtown. You would never see anything in the outer boroughs. And one more point, in case that's not driving it home, we had an idea recently of, you know, we had a heat wave, several heat waves in New York City, and we have cooling centers. We had hundreds of cooling centers that were available and that are open mostly for elderly residents to seek cooling when their AC goes out or power goes out. And we were talking about developing an API that would feed smartphones that would let you know if the cooling center was open. Well, how many 80-year-olds do you know that are using a smartphone to check to see if a cooling center is open? So as we talk about crowdsourcing and information and APIs, at least from the city's perspective, we have to be conscious that there's a huge silent group of people who are not participating in all of these data feeds. And how do we still make sure that we're using the data to serve them in traditional formats?
It'd be good to hear from any mayors or political leaders in the room to ask what of this actually sounds like things you could put into a program which your public would like, including the 80-year-olds who wouldn't really recognize an app that hit them on the head. Does anyone from a political background want to comment at this point? Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not a mayor. I'm a privacy commissioner.
Okay.
My name is Anne Kavukian. I'm the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, Canada. And I was just wanting, and I'm very grateful you made very respectful comments about privacy, but I wanted to, just wondering if I can nudge you away from the view that somehow privacy and innovation, privacy and big data are opposing forces. They're not. Privacy is an enabler of innovation. It can be embedded into the design of big data and open data analytics. There is so much that can be done by embedding privacy into design and making it much more attractive to both the citizens involved in terms of New York City and engaging their trust and engendering that, but also ensuring that it grows, that the big data efforts are not curtailed. We push open data, we push big data, but we just say not using personal data. So I'm just wondering if that kind of mindset could be grown so that people don't view privacy as a threat and it's opposing, it's holding technology back. It's not, but I know that's not the prevailing view, and I love your views on it.
Could you just comment, because you've been a champion of this field for many years, do you think cities are getting really what you've been advocating in terms of privacy enhancing technology and design, or are they missing a trick there?
European cities, Berlin, big success. A number of cities in Europe, very successful. Some Canadian cities, obviously I push it very strongly in Toronto, Canada, which is where I'm from. And some cities, California has some very successful ventures. And in terms of smart grid efforts, smart meters, etc., San Diego Gas and Electric, they've embedded privacy by design into their smart meter efforts and thereby engendered the trust of their citizens so that they haven't blocked these trucks from coming into their neighborhoods to actually install smart meters as they did when PG&E tried to do it and the public didn't know what they were doing, they didn't trust them. So there's a real privacy payoff to both companies and governments in embedding privacy by design and then telling their citizens and their customers about it. But I'd love your views on it. Thank you.
Emer.
I totally agree with what you're saying. What I would say is that at an official level, I think using the Data Protection Act, for example, so certainly I know when I started working in London on the Datastore, you know, I got huge pushback from officials saying, oh no, we can't do that, it's covered by the Data Protection Act, when in actual fact it wasn't. And so that, oh, it's a data protection issue was used as a pushback for officials who didn't want to do that. So I think it hasn't been helped by that. So people have called on data protection, you know, as a block when it really didn't need to be. So I think that sort of damaged a bit of the argument there. But I totally agree with you. And I think as we go, as people learn more and more about what companies know about us and how much data we give away, I mean, there was an innocence, I think, that people had at the beginning, you know, of using the net, and that our generation has now passed through. And so I think for younger people, I think they will want much more assurances, and that they will understand that as an exchange and a contract between what I am willing to give and what I want from you to protect my safety.
Is there a question there at the back? Yeah.
Yes, John Schoen at NBCnews.com. At one of the other panels, there was a discussion about cities trying to capture some of the value, for example, in commercial development when they extend a rail line better because it's investment of city resources and obviously private enterprises profiting from it. To the extent that cities are now developing these with these databases with taxpayer dollars and all of the work of the employees who are doing the data collection beyond the 8 people in the analytics department, shouldn't cities be looking for ways to monetize, much the way private companies have, to capture some of that value back for taxpayers?
Great question.
Just a quick crack at that. One of the people I spoke with at length when I was doing the research for the book was John Tolva, who's Rahm Emanuel's CTO in Chicago. And the metaphor that he used was cities should think of their data like the National Weather Service, right? It's almost like a utility that you pipe out so that the economy can create tremendous value on top of that, everything from farming to, you know, freight delivery or whatever it is, and that cities should think about their data, you know, as an economic resource.
I would add specifically to your question, we used to have some data sets in New York City that we charged money for, that specifically real estate agents and developers would be interested in, right? We've now made those data sets free because we value open data, and we want the information to be available to the public. Making those data sets free, putting them on the Open Data website, as you said, has costs. Is there a way that we could recoup some of those costs? Well, that's still being developed, but I think we would all agree that a citizen should be able to look at all of the property records or download a file 1 time, 2 times, 10 times, 20 times a year. But if you're pinging our database 10,000 times a day, maybe you should be paying for it, right? So there is an opportunity to monetize higher service data to actors who are getting real commercial benefit out of it.
I'm afraid we're pretty much out of time. I mean, I hope it's clear from this discussion, data is going to be a big part of the life of cities for the foreseeable future, full of excitement, full of unanswered questions, though, about exactly how to handle identity, monetization, the practical problems of skills and so on. I think there's still a bit of an issue in this field is many of the applications are coming from sort of brilliant technologists. They're not that well suited to the user's need, and they're often not developed with the users taking part in the process of design. So some of the data applications aren't really getting big enough take-up. But I started with Hal Varian saying statistics was sexy. Someone commented to me a few months ago, you know, the film The Graduate, if Dustin Hoffman was asking what field to go into now, it wouldn't be plastics, it definitely would be data. Thank you all to our panel, and watch this space.